From Roman forts, through medieval markets, and steam-powered mills, canals and railways built modern Manchester. From Roman forts, through medieval markets, and steam-powered mills, canals and...
Long before the mills, long before the railways, long before the music and the football and the gleaming glass towers, there was only landscape. The land that would eventually become Greater Manchester sat quiet and wild beneath enormous skies.
How much for the cloth?
By rivers, forests,
3 coppers,
and the
good
kind
quality.
Of ancient silence that is almost impossible to imagine today. The River Irwell cut through soft ground. The River Medlock ran cold and clear. Mosses and marshes stretched across low-lying areas, while higher ground offered shelter and sight lines across the surrounding territory. Scattered communities of Iron Age Britons, often referred to as Brigantes, lived throughout this landscape, farming small plots, raising cattle, and maintaining their own complex networks of trade and tribal relationships. They knew this land intimately, its seasons, its flooding patterns, its patches of good soil and dangerous bog. To most passing eyes, this northwest corner of Britain seemed unremarkable. No great harbor, no obvious abundance of precious metals, no overwhelming natural advantage that might attract the attention of a powerful outside force.
Look at the progress. It's coming together.
Aye, and more homes for families.
Rebuilding our city, just like the sign says.
A new Manchester for us all.
A civilization unlike any these forests had ever witnessed was already advancing northward. Its engineers studying the land with calculating
Pathway mapping is stabilizing. Let's proceed.
Agreed. Initiate synaptic integration.
Robotic arm is calibrated and ready. Excellent. Overlay the new data.
Confirmed. Execute.
Contact made. Votes for women. Equality for all.
Together, we shape the future.
From our history to tomorrow's dreams.
Forward together.
Elevated terrain overlooking the rivers and constructed a fort they called Mamucium, a name possibly derived from a local Brittonic word describing the breast-shaped hill upon which it stood. The fort followed the standard Roman design: rectangular defensive walls, internal barrack blocks, granaries, a headquarters building, and the full administrative infrastructure the Roman military carried everywhere it went. At its operational peak, Mamucium could garrison several hundred soldiers, primarily auxiliary troops, rather than the elite legionary units stationed at larger permanent bases elsewhere in Britain. Around the fort, a civilian settlement called a vicus gradually developed, as merchants, craftspeople, and families of soldiers established their own community immediately outside the military walls. This combination of military installation and civilian settlement created something genuinely new in this landscape: a permanent, organized community connected to an enormous network of roads, trade routes, and political authority stretching all the way to Rome itself. Evidence of this Roman presence survives today at Castlefield, where archaeology has revealed the fort's outline and provided fascinating glimpses into the daily lives of both soldiers and civilians who called this frontier outpost home. The fort would not last forever, but the location it established would become the seed of a future city. As the 5th century progressed and Roman authority in Britain gradually weakened and ultimately collapsed entirely, Mamucium was abandoned. The soldiers departed. The administrative machinery of empire dissolved. The roads remained, and some trade continued along them, but the organized, purposeful community that Roman authority had created gradually faded into a different, quieter kind of existence. This period, stretching across several centuries following Rome's withdrawal, remains relatively obscure beneath that historical record.
How much for the
Partly
cloth?
because the written
3
documentation
coppers, good
that
quality.
characterized Roman administration disappeared alongside the Romans themselves. Archaeological evidence suggests continued human activity throughout the former fort's vicinity, but on a significantly reduced scale compared to the Roman period. Germanic settlers, Anglo-Saxon migrations, and the gradual reshaping of Britain's political and cultural landscape all contributed to transforming what had been Roman Britain into something quite different. The name Mamucium gradually evolved through various forms, eventually producing the place name that would persist through all subsequent centuries of transformation: Mancunium, then Mamuciastra, and ultimately Manchester. Christianity spread throughout the region, with small churches becoming new focal points for community life, in ways that Roman temples had previously served. These early medieval centuries were quiet compared to what had come before and what was yet to come, but they were not empty. People lived, farmed, traded, and built community in this landscape through generations of unrecorded daily existence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new medieval community was beginning to grow. By the medieval period, Manchester had established itself as a modest but genuine market town, serving the agricultural communities scattered throughout its surrounding region. A market charter granted in 1301 formalized what had likely already been developing organically for some time, a regular gathering place where farmers, craftspeople, and traders could exchange goods and conduct the commercial transactions that kept rural communities functioning throughout the medieval economy. The collegiate church that would eventually become Manchester Cathedral stood as the community's spiritual and architectural centerpiece, its presence reflecting both the town's religious significance and the accumulated investment of generations who had built and maintained it. Medieval Manchester was never among England's largest or most prominent towns during this period, lacking the cathedral city status or strategic political importance that elevated places like York, Chester, or Lincoln to greater national significance. Yet it performed a vital regional function, connecting surrounding communities to broader trade networks, while gradually accumulating the commercial relationships, institutional structures, and physical infrastructure upon which subsequent growth would eventually build. The town's position within a productive agricultural region, combined with reliable river access and road connections extending in multiple directions, ensured steady, if unspectacular, commercial activity throughout the medieval centuries. Merchants came and went, markets filled and emptied with seasonal regularity. The town's modest skyline, dominated by its church tower and the rooftops of timber-framed buildings, changed slowly across generations. Yet beneath this quiet surface, a new industry was beginning to stir. Textile production had been part of English economic life for centuries before Manchester became particularly associated with it. But during the later medieval and early modern period, the town and its surrounding region began developing a specifically significant relationship with cloth manufacturing that would eventually prove transformative. The damp climate of northwest England, often complained about by visitors, actually provided surprisingly useful conditions for spinning and weaving, as moisture in the air helped prevent fragile threads from breaking during the production process. Wool had long been the dominant textile fiber throughout England, and Manchester merchants established themselves within broader wool trading networks, connecting the region to English and eventually continental markets. Linen manufacture similarly developed throughout the surrounding countryside, with rural households producing cloth during agricultural downtime as a valuable supplementary income source. Skilled weavers, often refugees from religious persecution elsewhere in Europe, including Flemish and Huguenot craftspeople who brought specialized techniques with them, settled in Manchester and surrounding towns, contributing expertise that enhanced local textile capabilities. The putting out system, where merchant capitalists distributed raw materials to rural households for processing and then collected finished cloth for sale, gradually organized this dispersed manufacturing activity into something approaching a genuine industry, even before purpose-built factories existed. Manchester merchants grew wealthy, coordinating these increasingly complex supply chains. The town's commercial networks expanded. Its reputation as a textile center grew steadily stronger with each passing decade. Yet none of this could have prepared anyone for what was coming. Machines were about to transform everything. The Industrial Revolution arrived in Manchester not as a single dramatic moment, but as an accelerating accumulation of innovations, investments, and organizational changes that gathered unstoppable momentum throughout the second half of the 18th century. Richard Arkwright's water frame, James Hargreaves's spinning jenny, and Edmund Cartwright's power loom transformed textile manufacturing from a craft practiced in homes and small workshops into an industrial process concentrated within purpose-built factory buildings. Steam engines, continuously improved by engineers, including James Watt, eventually liberated factory production from dependence on water power, allowing mills to be built wherever coal could be delivered rather than only beside fast-flowing rivers. Manchester found itself ideally positioned to benefit from these converging developments. Its existing textile trading networks provided ready markets for dramatically increased production volumes. Its growing population provided labor. Its entrepreneurial merchant class provided capital investment and commercial organization. Canal construction improved transportation, allowing coal from surrounding coal fields to reach the city more efficiently, while finished goods moved outward to coastal ports, connecting Manchester to national and global markets. The transformation was rapid and genuinely disorienting in its pace, reshaping the town's physical appearance, economic structure, and social composition within a single generation in ways that previously would have taken centuries. Factory buildings rose above the rooftops of older structures. Smokestacks became familiar features of the skyline. Workers flooded into the town from surrounding countryside and increasingly from further afield. Manchester was about to become the workshop of the world. By the early decades of the 19th century, Manchester had earned a nickname that captured its extraordinary industrial transformation in a single evocative word: Cottonopolis. Cotton had replaced wool as the dominant textile fiber, and Manchester stood at the absolute center of a global cotton industry connecting plantations in the American South and colonial territories with consumers throughout Britain, Europe, and beyond. The city's mills operated continuously, their machinery running day and night shifts that maintained constant production throughout every week of the year. Smoke hung permanently over the city, turning its skies a characteristic gray that visitors from other regions found simultaneously impressive and disturbing. The sheer scale of industrial activity was genuinely staggering by any previous historical measure, representing a concentration of productive capacity that had simply never existed anywhere in the world before. Manchester's population grew at a rate that astonished contemporary observers, swelling from perhaps 25,000 people in 1772 to over 300,000 by 1850, as workers migrated from across Britain and Ireland in search of employment within the city's expanding factories. Fortunes were made with remarkable speed by mill owners and merchants whose timing, business acumen, and access to capital positioned them to exploit this unprecedented industrial opportunity. Manchester became famous throughout the world as living proof that industrial capitalism could generate wealth on a previously unimaginable scale. Yet even as this extraordinary prosperity accumulated, a difficult truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Such magnificent prosperity came with a hidden, deeply human cost. Behind the impressive statistics of industrial production and accumulated wealth existed an entirely different story, written in the daily experiences of the hundreds of thousands of ordinary workers who provided the human labor keeping Manchester's mill economy functioning. Factory working conditions throughout this period were genuinely demanding and frequently dangerous, with long working hours, machinery that could cause serious injury, and air quality within spinning rooms that caused respiratory diseases affecting workers throughout their lives. Child labor was widespread, with children as young as 5 or 6 employed within factories performing tasks. Their small hands made them uniquely suitable for, in the industrial logic of the era. Neighborhoods housing Manchester's working population grew rapidly, but without adequate planning or infrastructure, producing overcrowded conditions that concerned social reformers and physicians who observed the direct connections between poor housing, contaminated water supplies, and the devastating disease outbreaks that periodically swept through working-class communities. Friedrich Engels, a German businessman's son who worked in Manchester in the 1840s, who documented working-class conditions with meticulous, disturbing precision, described scenes that shocked readers throughout Europe who had previously encountered only the prosperous, impressive face of industrial Manchester. Yet within these same communities, extraordinary resilience, solidarity, and determination existed alongside genuine hardship. Workers formed mutual aid societies, built community institutions, maintained family networks of support, and increasingly began organizing collectively to advocate for improvements to their working and living conditions. Their calls for change were growing louder with every passing year. Manchester became one of the most politically significant cities in 19th century Britain, generating reform movements, social campaigns, and radical ideas that shaped national political life far beyond the city's own boundaries. The Peterloo Massacre of August 1819 became perhaps the most powerful and haunting symbol of this period, when cavalry charged into a crowd of approximately 60,000 people gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Field to hear political speakers advocate for parliamentary reform. 18 people died, and hundreds were injured in scenes that horrified observers throughout Britain and hardened reformers' determination to change the political system that had authorized such violence against peaceful protesters. The Anti-Corn Law League, founded in Manchester in 1838 under the leadership of Richard Cobden and John Bright, campaigned successfully for the repeal of protectionist grain tariffs that kept bread prices artificially high and hurt working people most directly. Their eventual success in 1846 represented one of the most significant British political campaigns of the century, demonstrating that organized civic pressure could change national policy even without formal political power. Manchester's diverse and increasingly literate population supported a remarkable array of newspapers, political organizations, and public institutions that collectively created an unusually vibrant civic culture, constantly generating new ideas and demanding practical improvements. This combination of political energy, civic organization, and genuine social urgency made Manchester a genuinely important laboratory for ideas that would eventually shape British democratic development throughout the Victorian era. Manchester was becoming not only a city of industry, but a city of ideas. Manchester's reputation as a center of innovation extended far beyond its factory floors and political meeting halls into the laboratories, lecture rooms, and scientific institutions that made the city a genuine pioneer in advancing human knowledge. John Dalton, working in Manchester during the early 19th century, developed his atomic theory of matter, fundamentally transforming how scientists understood the basic building blocks of physical reality. James Prescott Joule conducted experiments in Manchester that established foundational principles of thermodynamics and the conservation of energy, contributing essential concepts to modern physics. The Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, established in 1781 and one of the oldest scientific organizations in Britain, provided an institutional home for intellectual exchange between scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and educated citizens, creating an unusually productive environment where practical industrial knowledge and theoretical scientific inquiry regularly influenced each other. Manchester's rapidly growing educational institutions reflected the city's recognition that continued innovation required sustained investment in human knowledge and capability. Owens College, founded in 1851 from a merchant's bequest and eventually growing into the Victoria University of Manchester, established the foundations for what would become one of Britain's leading research universities. This combination of scientific curiosity, practical engineering expertise, and institutional investment in education created distinctive innovative capacity within Manchester that consistently produced advances applicable to real-world problems. The city's intellectual traditions were proving as important to its identity as its industrial ones. Yet even as scientific discovery continued advancing, another revolution was already beginning that would dramatically expand Manchester's connections to the broader world. On September 15, 1830, something happened that would fundamentally change not just Manchester, but the entire world's understanding of what transportation could become. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity passenger railway operating regular scheduled services, opened with celebrations that attracted dignitaries, journalists, and curious spectators from throughout Britain and beyond. The railway demonstrated conclusively that steam-powered transportation could move people and goods faster, more reliably, and in greater quantities than any previous transportation technology, transforming fundamental assumptions about distance, time, and economic geography that had remained essentially unchanged throughout human history. Manchester's central position within this emerging railway network proved enormously significant for the city's continued commercial development, as rail connections progressively extended throughout Britain during subsequent decades, reducing transportation costs, accelerating delivery times, and allowing Manchester's manufacturers to serve national and international markets with dramatically improved efficiency. The railway also transformed Manchester's relationship with surrounding towns throughout the region, drawing them into increasingly integrated economic and social networks organized around the city as their commercial and transportation hub. Workers could travel longer distances to employment. Finished goods could reach distant markets within hours rather than days. Raw materials could be delivered with unprecedented reliability and speed. The psychological impact of the railway extended beyond its practical transportation functions, communicating a powerful message about human capability to master technology and reshape physical geography in service of economic ambition. Manchester's industrial influence, already substantial, now had new means of spreading far beyond its immediate geographic boundaries. As the 19th century progressed, Manchester's industrial success attracted people from throughout Britain and from increasingly distant origins, creating a genuinely diverse city whose character was shaped by successive waves of migration and settlement from multiple directions simultaneously. Irish immigration, already significant before the Victorian period, became particularly dramatic following the catastrophic Great Famine of the 1840s, when hundreds of thousands of desperate people fled starvation and arrived in British cities, including Manchester, seeking employment and survival. Irish communities established themselves throughout Manchester's working-class neighborhoods, bringing their own cultural traditions, religious practices, and community organizations that gradually became integrated into the city's broader social fabric. Jewish communities developed their own established neighborhoods and institutions, particularly in Cheetham Hill and Salford, contributing substantially to Manchester's commercial, professional, and cultural life across generations. Later migrations brought communities from across the British Empire and eventually from throughout the world, each group finding their own footing within Manchester's economic structures, while simultaneously enriching its cultural character in ways that accumulated across decades into something genuinely distinctive. The Manchester Ship Canal, opened in 1894 after enormous engineering effort, transformed the landlocked city into effectively a seaport, allowing ocean-going vessels to reach the city's docks directly and giving Manchester direct international trading connections previously dependent upon Liverpool as an intermediary. This remarkable engineering achievement symbolized Manchester's confidence and ambition, its determination to engineer solutions to geographic limitations that might have constrained less determined communities. The 20th century, however, would soon test this resilience with challenges no engineering project could fully prepare for. The First World War arrived in August 1914 and immediately began demanding sacrifices from Manchester that would leave permanent marks upon every street and neighborhood throughout the region. Manchester regiments recruited enthusiastically in the early months, with young men from factories, offices, and streets throughout Greater Manchester joining up in sufficient numbers to form the renowned Manchester Pals battalions, units composed of men who had worked and lived together and now faced combat together on the Western Front. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 devastated these units with catastrophic casualties that left entire communities simultaneously grieving men who had grown up together and died together. The industrial capacity of Manchester's factories proved crucial to the war effort, as mills and engineering works converted to produce military uniforms, equipment, and materials at scale that only a major industrial city could provide. The Second World War brought different but equally devastating challenges, as German bombing raids during the Manchester Blitz of December 1940 caused widespread destruction throughout the city center and surrounding areas, killing hundreds of civilians and destroying significant portions of the built environment that generations had created. Yet Manchester's response to these catastrophic events demonstrated exactly the resilience that had characterized the city throughout previous centuries of challenge. Communities rebuilt, factories resumed production, cultural life continued, institutions that had been damaged or destroyed were restored or replaced. Manchester had faced tests that genuinely threatened to break it and had endured each time through collective determination and mutual support. But a new and different challenge was already approaching. The decades following the Second World War brought a slow but ultimately devastating economic transformation that struck at the very foundations of Manchester's industrial identity. Cotton manufacturing, which had defined the city's global reputation for over a century, experienced catastrophic decline as competition from manufacturers in South and East Asia, where labor costs were dramatically lower, made British cotton production economically unsustainable at any scale comparable to its Victorian peak. Mill after mill closed throughout Manchester and the surrounding towns that had built their entire economic existence around textile production. Engineering industries that had provided alternative employment throughout the 20th century similarly contracted as global economic changes reduced demand for the products Manchester's factories had traditionally produced. Unemployment rose to levels that created genuine hardship throughout communities whose working lives had been organized around industrial employment for multiple generations. The physical landscape of industrial decline was genuinely distressing, with former mill buildings standing empty and deteriorating, housing stock in former industrial neighborhoods aging without adequate investment, and the general atmosphere of communities experiencing economic disruption without clear solutions. Young people with ambitions left for other cities or other countries, creating further challenges for communities already struggling with economic change. Politicians, planners, community organizations, and individual citizens debated competing visions for how Manchester might transform itself economically without losing its distinctive character and identity. This was perhaps the most difficult chapter in Manchester's long history, not because of external threats from enemies or natural disasters, but because the economic foundations that had made the city significant were visibly crumbling. Yet Manchester, as its entire history demonstrated, had never been a city that simply accepted defeat. Beginning tentatively in the 1980s and accelerating significantly throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, Manchester embarked upon a remarkable process of urban regeneration that gradually transformed former industrial wastelands into new residential, commercial, cultural, and educational districts. The Castlefield area, where Roman Mamucium had originally stood nearly 2,000 years earlier, became an early focus of regeneration efforts, with former warehouses and canal basins converted into apartments, bars, restaurants, and cultural venues that attracted new residents and visitors to a previously neglected part of the city. The devastating IRA bomb attack of June 1996, which destroyed significant portions of Manchester city center, paradoxically accelerated urban transformation by creating an unavoidable need for comprehensive rebuilding that planners and developers approached with genuine ambition rather than simple restoration. New buildings, public spaces, and infrastructure created by the rebuilding process gave the city center a contemporary confidence that older, piecemeal development could never have produced as quickly. Major sporting events, including the 2002 Commonwealth Games, generated investment in East Manchester's infrastructure and facilities, while simultaneously demonstrating Manchester's capacity to organize major international events successfully. Media City UK in Salford, developed from former Dockland, attracted BBC departments, creative industry businesses, and related enterprises that established a significant new economic cluster within the broader metropolitan region. These cumulative regeneration efforts gradually created a genuinely transformed city, retaining recognizable connections to its industrial history while building new economic foundations appropriate for a 21st century metropolitan economy. Culture, it was becoming clear, would help redefine the city's identity. If Manchester's Victorian identity had been defined by cotton and steam, its late 20th and early 21st century identity became increasingly defined by music, football, and a broader cultural confidence that attracted global attention, far exceeding what the city's size alone might suggest warranted. The music scene that emerged from Manchester during the late 1970s, and particularly throughout the 1980s and 1990s, produced bands and artists whose influence extended throughout global popular culture in ways that brought the city's name recognition to audiences with no particular knowledge of its industrial history or civic achievements. The Hacienda nightclub, Factory Records, the bands that emerged from this extraordinarily creative environment. These cultural phenomena made Manchester synonymous with a particular kind of musical innovation and cultural energy that captured imaginations worldwide. Manchester's two major football clubs, Manchester United and Manchester City, both developed into global sporting brands during this period, attracting supporters, commercial partners, and media attention from every inhabited continent, making Manchester familiar to sports audiences throughout the world, regardless of any other connection to the city. This combination of musical and sporting global recognition gave Manchester a cultural platform that proved enormously valuable for attracting tourism, investment, and the kind of talented individuals who increasingly choose where to live and work, partly based on cultural vitality alongside purely economic considerations. Yet even as this cultural renaissance continued reshaping Manchester's global identity, the city maintained its older and equally important tradition as a place where serious intellectual inquiry and scientific discovery continued producing achievements of global significance. The University of Manchester, formed through the merger of previous institutions and carrying forward intellectual traditions, stretching back through Owens College to the remarkable scientific culture of Victorian Manchester, continued generating world-class research across multiple disciplines throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The university's extraordinary record of Nobel Prize winners, more than 25 in total across various fields, making it one of the most Nobel-decorated universities in the world, reflects the genuine depth and sustained excellence of research traditions that have made Manchester one of Britain's most significant centers of scientific and intellectual achievement. Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov's isolation of graphene at the University of Manchester in 2004, for which they received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010, exemplified this tradition of fundamental scientific breakthrough, as this remarkable two-dimensional material with extraordinary physical properties opened entirely new possibilities for future technological development across multiple industries. Manchester's multiple universities, including Manchester Metropolitan University alongside the University of Manchester, collectively educate tens of thousands of students annually, contributing substantially to the knowledge economy that increasingly drives the city's 21st century economic development. Biomedical research clusters, digital technology industries, and creative enterprises increasingly locate themselves in Manchester, partly because of the talent, knowledge, and institutional connections that the city's research universities provide. This sustained intellectual tradition, from John Dalton's atomic theory through graphene's isolation, represents a thread of genuine achievement connecting Manchester's scientific present to its remarkable scientific past. The city keeps evolving, building new achievements upon the foundations laid by previous generations. Greater Manchester today encompasses 10 metropolitan boroughs: Manchester, Salford, Trafford, Stockport, Tameside, Oldham, Rochdale, Bury, Bolton, and Wigan, forming a combined metropolitan region of approximately 2.8 million people that represents one of Britain's most significant economic and demographic centers outside London. This administrative geography, formalized in its current form in 1974, reflects centuries of functional interconnection between communities that had developed alongside each other throughout the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath, their histories intertwined through shared economic development, transportation networks, cultural traditions, and increasingly integrated urban geography. The Greater Manchester Devolution Agreement, building progressively since 2014, and representing one of the most significant transfers of political authority from central government to regional governance in modern British history, has given the metropolitan region new powers over transport, economic development, planning, and increasingly health and social care, creating a more integrated and locally accountable system of metropolitan governance than had previously existed. Transport for Greater Manchester operates one of England's most extensive public transportation networks, including the Metrolink tram system that has expanded dramatically to connect communities throughout the metropolitan area that industrial-era railways had not previously served. These institutional and infrastructure developments reflect a broader understanding that Greater Manchester's future prosperity depends upon the effective integration and coordination of all 10 boroughs, rather than competition between them, building collective strength upon the foundation of shared history. The journey from Roman frontier fort to modern metropolitan region continues unfolding with each passing year. Behind every significant achievement throughout Greater Manchester's extraordinary history stand individual people whose stories deserve recognition alongside the broader narratives of industrial transformation.
Look at the progress. It's coming together.
Aye, and more homes for families.
Rebuilding our city, just like the sign says.
A new Manchester for us all.
Industrial Revolution, leaving familiar rural communities for the unfamiliar noise and pace of factory life, demonstrated courage and adaptability that made the entire economic transformation possible, whatever its accompanying hardships. The Irish families who fled starvation during the 1840s and rebuilt their lives within Manchester's working-class communities, maintaining cultural identity while integrating into the city's broader social life, created communities of remarkable resilience. Jewish entrepreneurs, professionals, and community leaders who contributed substantially to Manchester's commercial and cultural development across multiple generations left permanent marks on the city's character that persist today throughout its neighborhoods, institutions, and cultural traditions. South Asian communities who arrived during the post-war decades to work in industries that desperately needed labor, subsequently building their own business networks, cultural institutions, and civic organizations, transformed neighborhoods throughout Greater Manchester in ways that enriched the metropolitan region's diversity and cultural vitality. Women workers whose labor sustained the cotton economy for generations, whose campaigns for political rights helped shape British democracy, and whose domestic labor maintained the communities that made industrial Manchester function. Their contributions demand recognition alongside the factory owners and inventors who typically receive more prominent historical acknowledgement. Every generation has contributed its own layer to Greater Manchester's complex, rich, and still evolving identity. One final chapter remains, gathering all these threads into a single, conclusive reflection. The empires disappeared. Roman soldiers left their Mamucium fort and were never replaced by any comparable imperial authority in this northwest corner of Britain. The mills that defined Manchester's Victorian identity fell silent across the decades of industrial decline, their machinery removed, their workers dispersed, their extraordinary productive energy belonging entirely to history. Skylines that had been dominated by factory chimneys and mill buildings transformed into landscapes of office towers, university buildings, and residential developments that their Victorian predecessors would find almost completely unrecognizable. Yet through all these transformations, from Roman frontier to medieval market town, from industrial powerhouse to cultural capital, from cotton exchange to graphene laboratory, something essential about Greater Manchester endured and continues enduring today. It is the spirit of a place that has consistently refused to accept the limitations imposed by geography, circumstance, or historical decline. A spirit that attracted people from across Britain and the world to build their lives and contribute their energies to a city perpetually in the process of becoming something greater than it had previously been. A spirit that produced political reformers willing to face cavalry charges for democratic principles, scientists who rewrote fundamental laws of physics, musicians who changed global popular culture, and communities that maintained solidarity and mutual support through every economic challenge their city faced. From a small Roman frontier fort established nearly 2,000 years ago to one of the world's genuinely great metropolitan cities, Greater Manchester's story remains above all a human story, built not by empires alone, but by generations of determined, creative, resilient, ordinary people whose accumulated efforts changed the world.